All right, are we live? It looks like we are just about ready to go. Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Rich Newman. I'm a professor of history at Rochester Institute of Technology, and it's my distinct pleasure to host this LSU Press remote author talk featuring Ben Wright, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Texas, Dallas. He's the author of a wonderful new publication entitled Bonds of Salvation, How Christianity Inspired and Limited American Abolitionism. We've got a wonderful conversation and chat set up for you today. And right off the bat, we're going to invite you all to participate by posting some questions. They're going to come through the LSU Press filter and then make their way to us. We have some pre-formatted questions, but we'd love to get you all involved. So don't be shy and make sure that you reach out as soon as possible. I'm going to turn the floor over to Ben in just a minute, but first of all, we want to make sure that everyone's on the same page about where to get this terrific book. We have been told that it is already in the warehouses and ready to ship. So if you are interested in purchasing Bonds of Salvation, we're going to invite you to go to your favorite platform. You can go to the LSU Press website and purchase a copy, and it'll get out to you hopefully before Christmas. You can go on over to Amazon or to any of the independent bookstore websites that have been set up. You can even go to your favorite independent bookstore. Mine happens to be Talking Leaves in Buffalo, New York, where I'm going to go purchase a copy of Ben Wright's book. Whatever you do, make sure that you support LSU Press and all university presses because they make work like this possible. So without further ado, we're going to bring Ben Wright in here to talk about the inspiration behind Bonds of Salvation. And Ben, the big question right off the bat is what this book is about. Can you give us an overview of Bonds of Salvation, including some of the main themes behind this great book?
Sure, I'll try. Okay, so Bonds of Salvation, as the subtitle says, is a story about how Christianity both inspired and limited the fight against slavery in the United States. It's a story that stretches from the American Revolution to the Civil War. And I begin in the American Revolution by unfolding what I see as two competing ideologies. The first I call purificationism. And here we would identify a lot of the kind of traditional actors associated with American anti-slavery. Of course, the Black Church, Quakers, briefly Southern evangelicals. These folks believed that in order to bring salvation in the United States, the nation had to be free of the sin of slavery. And they worked to kind of coercively prevent their members from participating in what they see as this sin. Now, the larger ideology, however, that I identify, I call conversionism. And this is the belief that in order to make the world a better place, what we should do is focus on expanding salvation by generating more and more Christian conversions. Folks genuinely believed in this era that with enough conversions, all of these sins of the world, including the sin of slavery, would wash away in this kind of glorious Christian millennium. So I start with these two ideologies and then explain how conversionism triumphed over purificationism. And the rest of the book really tracks what happens with conversionism all the way up through the Civil War. So one of the first things that happens is that in order to extend these missions of salvation, Americans have to coordinate. And churches begin to network with one another on larger and larger scales until eventually we have national denominations beginning to form. Now, I argue that these national denominations form some of the earliest sense of what it meant to be an American. Americans identified with their denominational network, and those networks in turn launched all sorts of social reform, what historians call the benevolent empire. All of these things, missionary societies, tract societies, Bible societies, and in fact, anti-slavery societies grew out of these denominational networks. Maybe most consequentially, in 1815, a group of Presbyterians formed the American Colonization Society, this massive national attempt to both solve the problem of slavery and bring salvation to Africa by relocating Black Americans to West Africa. Of course, most Black Americans were not interested in being relocated across the ocean, so Black activists resisted colonization, and increasingly white abolitionists came by their side also to oppose it. But in order to oppose colonization, anti-slavery folks, abolitionists, had to create their own understanding of global salvation, their own plan to save the world. By the mid-1830s, and especially in the 1840s, abolitionists came to believe that enslavers could no longer serve as agents of salvation. They could no longer carry the gospel. When abolitionists believed this, it really formed the death knell for national American Protestantism. We have schisms among Presbyterians in 1837, Methodists in 1844, Baptists in 1845, that divide Christians along the kind of fault lines of slavery and salvation. And once Christians, North and South, were divorced from one another through these denominational schisms, sectionalism only increased, and the nation accelerated on its path towards civil war and eventual emancipation. So again, this is a book about how Christianity both inspired and limited American abolitionism. And the title, Bonds of Salvation, refers to the fact that it's salvation and pursuits of salvation that tie the nation together in the late 18th century, early 19th century, nearly tear it apart during the Civil War, and that the pursuit of salvation, in fact, was a bondage of its own that tightened the shackles of slavery.
That's a wonderful reply, and it gives us a lot of fodder for discussion. So again, I'm going to invite people as we move along here to post your questions to us, and we'll make sure that Ben gets a chance to answer them. But the next thing that I'm thinking about here is inspiration. How did you come on to this project? What made you want to work on this in graduate school and then turn it into a monograph? Because it's a really important part of American historiography and religious studies. There's a lot of great work out there. What made you come to this project?
I'm in it for the money, Rich, mostly. This is a
like all academics.
Yeah. So actually, I would say that, my life project, or the question that, animates all my research and sadly wakes me up too often in the middle of the night, is trying to understand the ways that religion shapes how Americans understand, respond to, and too often perpetuate racial inequality. So if you're somebody that is preoccupied with that question, obviously the history of slavery and anti-slavery is an irresistible place to start. I'll also say that in very early research, I stumbled upon this Methodist missionary, and I was reading his diary, and I found this passage that actually opens the book. So I'll share it with you all here now. And I'll say that this first sentence is particularly fun as a native Wisconsinite who now happily lives in the South. So the first sentence is kind of fun, but I think the rest of the passage is also fairly powerful. And again, this is Methodist missionary Joshua Marsden writing in 1814. Never go to the southern states of America. They are polluted with slavery, and slavery is the most demoralizing thing under the sun. It is the parent of oppression, the nurse of sloth and guilty passions. It is the bane of man, the abomination of God. Where slavery reigns, a human being is made a beast of burden or the slave of lust. The poor, half-famished Negro trembles at a tyrant's nod and loses every good quality in the servility of a drudge or the wickedness of a prostitute. And then he ends by thundering, "Oh, that this scandal of humanity were annihilated." Now, I read this and I was excited that I had discovered this great new anti-slavery thinker that great historians like Rich Newman had somehow missed. I believed I was onto something really exciting. But then I spent a lot of time chasing down Joshua Marsden, and I found that he never signed an anti-slavery petition. He never joined an anti-slavery society. He never wrote a letter to a legislator encouraging abolition. He really did nothing except for write these words in his private diary, which of course were later published. But his hypocrisy really was the kind of starting point of this project. Of course, what Marsden does do is he works as a missionary. And later in his diary, I see again and again him referring to his belief that by extending the gospel, he is going to bring emancipation. He is going to bring about the end of slavery. So this book really started, one, with this preoccupying question of religion and race, and the specific problem of these Christians who privately condemned slavery but publicly did nothing, trying to understand how do they justify that in action. And that's what led me to conversionism. Yeah.
Wow, you offered me some insights there that I hadn't heard before. So again, I think there's a lot of fodder for discussion here, but you're leading me to the next big question, which is about historiography. Once again, this is a field that is filled with important studies about the American Colonization Society, salvation, religious schism, You've worked with some of these luminaries. For historians in the know, what's new here? What's the big historiographical takeaway about Ben Wright's Bonds of Salvation?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you acknowledge, and I will reiterate that, I stand on the shoulders of giants. The history of American abolition has been studied extensively for many, many decades. And I actually have to put you on the spot, Rich, that Rich's own work was really kind of fairly influential. His transformation of American anti-slavery, American abolitionism, really encouraged me to pursue this early era of anti-slavery studies. But fortunately, Rich made room for future scholars by explicitly stating in his introduction that he's going to focus on political action, not on the religious inspiration of this activism. So thank you for that, Rich. I have a career because of your decision, I think. So that's really what I was interested in is, I think a generation of historians since Rich have picked up this mantle, and we've had all sorts of great new studies on the political activism of abolitionists. I think of Paul Porgar's fantastic book, of course, Manisha Sinha's Magisterial Synthesis, all of these other folks that I think are putting at the center of the story what actually happens, how do activists try to confront this? But the question that interests me most of all was, how did religion structure the possibilities of this movement? And how did religion not only kind of structure the possibilities, but create the limitations of what those political activists could get done? So that's the kind of broad orientation I think that I have within historiography. I'll maybe highlight three quick things very briefly that this book also does. One, my framework of conversionism and purificationism, which I alluded to earlier. It's embarrassing to say that I kind of coined a phrase, but this is the paradigm that I found most useful in thinking about early anti-slavery and really thinking about the ways that Christians try to make the world a better place. Do we focus on looking without or within? So I think, conversionism and purificationism hopefully will be a useful analytical framework for folks. One that I think gets us places that, David Bryan Davis's old gradualism and immediatism doesn't. Second, for historians of religion, we still kind of loom in Nat Hatch's shadow of the democratization of American Christianity. Historians have pushed against this kind of meta-narrative, but I think I'm doing so also in a different way, by reminding us that the early republic and the antebellum period is also a place of religious creation, religious consolidation. Denominational history might be kind of dry, but it's really, really important. Again, I think that if we want to understand the history of American nationalism, it's through denominations that Americans become Americans and identify themselves as such, connected with folks, half a continent away. I also think that if you look very closely at all of the wings of the benevolent empire, all of these reform movements, they all spring from denominational networks. Okay, so then finally, colonization, which really is the narrative hinge of my book. It really, it's the subject of chapters 3 and 4. Historians have recognized religion as a central role, but I think that we can go a little bit further. I think the ACS is the most, maybe the most influential missionary institution in the antebellum period. The ABCFM might rival it, but we have to understand the ACS as being entirely dependent upon conversionist Christianity. Without conversionism, there would be no colonization. And similarly, if we want to understand the movement to fight colonization, we have to take seriously the ways in which these folks had to create a kind of counter narrative, a counter vision of what global salvation would look like and how it would occur, one divorced from colonization. And I guess maybe the last thing I'll say is, going back to denominations, I think, again, we can't understand the way in which secession occurred without understanding how consequential nationalisms were formed through religious identities and denominational networks. And when those networks are broken, the road to secession is accelerated.
This notion that you conjure of structuring the possibilities, I think, is really critical. And I think it gives us the opportunity to talk about a lot of different things, including the meaning of colonization as an anti-slavery movement. But I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here and ask you a question that's a little off the radar, but I think is germane to your overview. And it's this: do you think, from reading the folks that you've studied for years now, honestly, do you think that there's a theological crisis that revolves around anti-slavery well before the 1840s in the Civil War era? In other words, after the Revolution into the early 19th century, are the people that you're focusing on really struggling with this issue and deciding that in terms of structuring the possibilities, this is the better course of action, um, focusing on salvation rather than prosecuting abolition because abolition's unpopular, it's tough, there's not any consensus on this. And this creates this theological crisis that people solve by saying, okay, salvation's the way out.
Yeah. So I think a way of interpreting your question is, did folks actually believe in conversionism, or was it just the kind of excuse to justify their inaction, an action that might be rooted in other motivations, white supremacy probably the number one. And I think the only way to answer, I think the way that we answer that often tells more about what we think as historians than what the folks in the past actually thought themselves. Judging degrees of religious sincerity is impossible. And I think generally, when historians do that, I find them often just kind of inserting their views on the past. My method as a historian is I tend to take people at their word at what they say. Also, I would say ultimately, whether or not folks actually genuinely believed that conversionism would solve the problem of slavery, or whether it just created enough kind of, psychological, theological even space for them to justify their inaction, that is ultimately kind of inconsequential for the narrative that we tell as historians. I'll quickly also say you used the phrase theological crisis. So of course, historians, when they hear that phrase, will often go to Mark Noll, whose great work on the Civil War as a theological crisis essentially argues that American Christianity broke down because of competing ways of reading the Bible. Of course, if you have a literist reading of scripture, the Bible does defend slavery. Abolitionists then, in order to defend their anti-slavery Christianity, had to invent a kind of new hermeneutic, a new way of reading the Bible. And I think Noll's book is fantastic, and I cite it up and down. My work defends heavily on Noll. But I would argue that actually the more severe theological crisis in the late antebellum period is not over hermeneutics, it's over the question of who is fit to carry the gospel. This is, of course, what really is behind the schisms in the Presbyterian and especially the Methodist and the Baptist Church. So there were, many theological crises in American history. And in the late antebellum one, I think it's the collision of slavery and salvation that ruptures American Protestantism.
Right. And I like the way that you frame that. And of course, I'm thinking of Mark Noll when I use the phrase theological crisis. But going back to David Bryan Davis and an earlier generation of abolitionist scholars, you could argue that they were indeed saying that Quakers went through a theological crisis in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Some Baptist denominations, some Methodist denominations did. But what's so powerful about your work is you show that by the early 1800s, certain groups of revivalists, any number of Protestants solved that spiritual crisis by saying, this isn't really about slavery, it's about the bigger problem of sin in the world, and we got to conquer that. And so they pick up that older thread of Christianity, which was all about spreading the gospel to solve the sins that beset everybody, and slaveholding was only one of those sins. So I think your work allows us to go back to an earlier era and talk about theological crisis and abolitionism in a very meaningful way. Let me ask another question here then. Again, a little off the radar, but I think it's really important at this moment. And again, I realize that some people might have questions, and hopefully you're posting them. They're going to come through to me soon. You talk about the importance and power of conversionist sentiment. When we talk about colonization, one of the things that some of these salvationists have to do is convert skeptical slaveholders, skeptical anti-abolitionists to support colonization on theological grounds, on reform grounds. So what did you discover when you went into their bag of rhetorical tricks? What are the people that you studied in the early 1800s saying to their co-religionists about anti-slavery, if not abolition. In other words, you can support colonization. It fits with your denominational outlook for these reasons. Was there anything surprising in that rhetoric that caught you off guard?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, I think that the question of, what is the relationship between Christianity and conversion and slavery and slave management? That was a very live question in the 16th century and in the 18th century. And I think that, some of the best work on that has already been done in previous centuries by, Rebecca Getz and Catherine Gerbner, who kind of show how Christianity becomes, sacralized as a component of enslaving institutions. And so there's a lot of momentum that's carrying into the 19th century from earlier centuries. But I do spend a lot of time talking about the Methodist mission to the slaves, which I argue is the most successful agent of Christianization in United States history. It's hand in hand with the injustices of slavery, where essentially enslavers themselves came to Methodist leadership and asked the Methodists to bring Christianity to their slaves as a way of, their enslaved laborers, as a way of, bringing order and bringing, aiding the kind of, project of enslavement. So I guess to discreetly answer your question, the belief that salvation is going to solve everything starts as a kind of anti-slavery, I think a kind of ineffectual anti-slavery discourse that funnels a lot of humanitarian sensibility towards an unproductive place. By the time we get to the 1830s, though, that same ideology now becomes the most powerful weapon against abolitionists. Abolitionists are being drummed out of churches in the 18 teens because they're seeing their work as distracting from the real work of bringing salvation, which according to conversionism will eventually bring true emancipation.
Terrific, terrific. We have some wonderful comments and questions, and we'll get to some shout outs as we move along, people that you know quite well, Ben, and some folks that I know too. But I'm going to go to this question by Eric Fackler. Thank you for asking this. It relates back to your opening quote and the inspiration of Marsden in your career and work. So he asks, in your view, what was the cause of the lack of action on the part of Marsden and other missionaries and reformers who condemned slavery yet did not actively participate in abolitionism? That's a fabulous question.
Yeah. So one, I think that there is a shared ideology of progress in the late 18th and early 19th century, that folks genuinely believe that the world is getting better. It's getting better somewhat inevitably, whether it's the expansion of holiness or the, unfolding of enlightenment. Both of these strains of 18th century thought lead to this expectation of progress. So if you expect progress, why rock the boat? Why, cause kind of, this divisive mess? So one, it's this expectation of progress. Two is this belief that that progress would be most surely and readily realized by simply extending Christian conversion. So if you believe in those two things are going to get better, and that salvation is the best way to solve problems. Abolitionism is contentious. It involves, agitating, involves political activism. And folks just genuinely believed that progress would come not through these ways, but instead simply by focusing on the expansion of Christianity. Thanks, Eric.
That's interesting. You could argue that adopting an abolitionist worldview is also part and parcel of adopting a kind of biracial view of Christianity, because so many abolitionists are inspired by Black versions of the gospel. And that turns off a lot of missionaries and colonizationists. So again, I think you're putting your finger on some really important points here. So we have, again, some really great questions that revolve around inspiration, surprises in your research. The great thing is we have a lightning round lined up, so hang in there. If you're asking those questions, we'll get to them. I'm going to try to get to some of the bigger queries. And Jill Wharton asks this. Since you named a few of the denominational schisms that erupted between 1837 and 1845, could you touch on some of the international factors that led American religious leadership to breaking points in that decade? Another great question.
Yeah, that's excellent. Okay, so first of all, the invitation to think about the wider context is really helpful. So I think it would be hard pressed to overestimate the significance of the Haitian Revolution on the American psyche throughout the antebellum period. So first of all, Southerners are constantly, rightfully, terrified of the possibility of slave rebellion. Haiti proved, that it's possible, and the constant activism of enslaved people resisting their own enslavement by all manner of means reminded enslavers of the kind of tenuous nature of this institution. I mean, we have to remember that slavery is living in a constant state of war. It is a system of kind of constant oppression. So one, we've got the Haitian Revolution in the Caribbean, and in a way that begins to loom even larger after 1833 with the announcement of British emancipation. So for Southerners, there's this kind of belief of themselves as embattled, which of course is in many ways the direct cause of secession in general, was the conquering of this kind of deep paranoia among Southern leaders that caused them to vastly overestimate Northern commitments to anti-slavery, which in fact, I sometimes wish that the northern part of the United States was the vision of what Southerners thought it was at this time. I also would point to, British activists, which are constantly kind of encouraging, encouraging both actively and just generally, I think Christopher Leslie Brown's moral capital goes two ways. One, Britain gains moral capital with the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and there's another dose of that comes in 1833 with the announcement of emancipation coming in the Caribbean. So I think I would point to that to those as the kind of wider international context. But I also again want to say that none of those things could have convinced American Protestants to stop working together. The only thing that could do that was when abolitionists began to say that enslavers could not be the carriers of salvation, and the insistence that Southerners had in fact provoking this controversy by demanding that Northerners acknowledge that enslavers could in fact be carriers of the gospel. That is the question that led to the breaking point.
Fascinating. Karen Thomas has been active. She's posted a comment and a question, and I'm going to get to her question here, which in a way builds on the last question, but it's not about international perspectives per se, but it goes outside of the mainstream of Protestantism. Karen Thomas asks, where were the Roman Catholics in the whole on the whole slavery issue, particularly on colonization in this era that you're discussing?
Yeah. Thank you, Karen, for that question. Well, first of all, my book does focus on American Protestantism. And one of the reasons for that is, in my early research, I did have Catholics as part of the story. But especially in the earliest decades of the 19th century, Catholics are largely kind of wildly outnumbered in the United States. And a lot of their activity on the issue of slavery is mostly trying to preserve the kind of tenuous rights, privileges, even not, and maybe not even rights, of existing as Catholics in a largely Protestant country. So the large waves of immigration, of Catholic immigration, don't come until the kind of very later antebellum period. So they're largely outside of this study is the kind of very short answer. I will say one thing about Catholic thought kind of more broadly when it comes to the question of the biblicism of slavery. Catholics had this kind of great wrench in the story of introducing the concept of history as a category which to think about slavery in the Bible. Catholics were really the only major intellectual community that raised the point that, what the Bible says about slavery has to do with a previous type of slavery, which is fundamentally different from slavery as it exists in the United States. Protestant discussions about this issue never really kind of raised that historical point. And maybe that has to do with the kind of difference of the ways that Protestants read the Bible versus Catholics.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the Catholic Church globally in the rise of slaving systems. But in the 19th century, in the era that you're looking at, before the Civil War, you could argue that American Catholics become American by somehow either ignoring abolition or somehow making peace with bondage. And we can think about all of the reconciliation that folks in the Catholic Church are going, all the reconciliation moments that folks in the Catholic Church are going through now, especially at places like Georgetown University, Catholic institution, invested in the slave trade to save the university in the 1830s and 40s, so that people in the Catholic Church didn't necessarily see salvation through abolitionism. So it's an interesting question, but that leads me to this next question from Brian Franklin, who wants us to uh, ask you a little bit more about the connections between denominationalism and nationalism. So Brian Franklin asks, can you talk a little bit more about how denominational connections help feed nationalism, or how I think you said it, how Americans came to conceive of themselves as Americans? I guess he's arguing or asking through salvation.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So I had no interest in doing denominational history when I came to this project. In fact, I had a deep, deep resistance to it. I was forced to do it because denominations really, really matter to Americans. It's what they're talking about. It's how they're organizing themselves socially. And it's what's really kind of sowing the seeds of the benevolent empire. So I'm a reluctant, convert, if you will, to denominational history, I guess. But the point about nationalism that I want to make is, the United States is created, and now it has to create not only a government, but a sense of kind of communal identity across, what originally were 13 colonies that were very, very different. In fact, some of these colonies founded themselves in opposition to other colonies. And now they're going to have to come together and be a kind of one body politic. And so, national institutions in this early period were very limited. There's not much that actually ties an American in Connecticut to an American in Georgia. Denominations became, I think, some of the most powerful early connections that did, in fact, unify these people. So I think, people came to be an American often sometimes by their commitment to, I am a Presbyterian. And being a Presbyterian means that I am part of, this General Assembly that gathers together, that shares sermons from folks north and south. The coastal elites and folks on the frontier are reading this as well. And these denominational identities nationalize people's consciousness and then create the practical kind of networks for an American, any kind of American action to occur. Requires this infrastructure, and it's denominational connections that are making this. Because Brian's a historian, I'll kind of highlight, I was really influenced by Daniel Walker Howe's What Hath God Wrought, is, where he emphasizes the practical connections of technology, of communication revolutions. But so much of what he attributes to, the telegraph, the railroad, the post office, and things like that, I think that a lot of that work was actually done even earlier through denominational relationships and denominational infrastructures as well.
And of course, when you're talking about denominationalism and salvation in this period, we can't forget that African Americans are forming some of the most powerful and important denominations in American culture, and they're explicitly aimed at a version of salvation that goes against mainstream Protestantism. In other words, the sin of the nation, slavery, has to be eradicated before Americans can step into their exceptionalist shoes and march forward to a promised land. So it's very interesting response.
I wanted to just quickly talk about, Black denominations and Black denominationalism as well. So for the white, religious leaders that I'm talking about, denominational leadership forces them to take stands on political issues. So I see this, Richard Fuller, William Ellery Channing, all of these kind of, folks that are reluctant to engage in politics, but because of their denominational authority are kind of pushed to make comments on political issues. The process is reversed for Black Christians. The ability to be non-political, that's an element of white privilege. Black bodies are inherently politicized in an era to where Blackness is associated with slavery. To be Black and to be free is to be a living political statement. I think it probably still is. So Black denominational leadership often actually emerges from Black political organizing, Black community activism. So I think that's we can talk about Black denominations, we can talk about white denominations. It's important for us to be very aware of how white supremacy structures very different power relationships across in this period.
Yes, well said. And that leads us to our next question. Don't worry, folks, we're getting to our speed round. So hang in there for the research questions and the inspiration questions. But Melinda Kalinzis has been active, a couple of questions, and she wants us to talk about the supervision of Black churches after Nat Turner. I'll read the full question. Thank you for this. It's another great question. Could we discuss how the increased control and supervision of Black churches after Nat Turner's rebellion interacts with these religious ideologies that you're discussing?
Thank you for that question, Melinda. I appreciate that. Well, as you know, Melinda, we have to think about Nat Turner's rebellion in its relationship with David Walker's appeal, with the beginning of the publication of The Liberator, this adoption of increasingly confrontational, uncompromising rhetoric that really undercuts the previous logic of conversionism. Walker is very explicit in fact, denying the Christianity of white Americans, saying that this is not Christianity. William Lloyd Garrison, thunders uncompromisingly about the injustice of slavery. And that kind of shift in religious discourse, which seems a move away from the anchor of American Protestantism, which was conversionism, seems to be personified and made real with Nat Turner's rebellion. Or, I follow Vanessa Holden and think that we should maybe really call it the Rebellion of Southampton, and that it's not just Turner, it's a kind of community activism as well. But of course, Turner himself and this community were deeply steeped in Christianity. And I think that, the historian Christopher Tomlins, I think makes it very convincing case that we have to take Turner seriously, not only as a kind of military leader, but as a religious thinker, someone who has a vision of what justice and these actions are. And of course, Turner's confessions were published, and the folks that read them were exposed to a counter narrative of Christianity that ran right against the ideology of conversionism. And this is really untenable. When you take conversionism away from American Protestantism, it crumbles.
Or again, I'll say a certain type of conversionism, because African American preachers and congregations are invested in this project of conversion, but it's defined as outside the mainstream, anti-union, anti-American in a way. So I think it's always important to keep those things in mind, and I know you do in the book. And so again, I think we're getting to some really fruitful conversations. Okay, folks, I think we are ready for the lightning round, and if we run out of lightning round questions, we'll come back to some bigger questions too. But I think there's some really great queries here that Ben, you can hit pretty quickly. Lindsay Chervinsky, historian of note out there, asks a really wonderful question that I think all historians want to ask other historians. What was your favorite discovery while doing your research?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, so I can't tell you the fun answer. The fun answer is not appropriate for a book talk, but anybody that wants to buy me a drink at any point, I will tell you how Stephen Grellett introduced me to ghosts. So that's the first thing I'll say. That's a teaser. I will say, this is not fun per se, but it was really kind of powerful and convincing. This book forced me to kind of confront the necessity of humility when doing works of history. We know what happens. We have an element of clarity when we go to the sources that our historical actors don't. And so I would say that the act of writing this book, increased my kind of epistemological humility about the way that I think about the past, and quite frankly, the way that I think about the present as well. I will say that another kind of exciting discovery was, well, first of all, in some ways, the archival work of this project came when I found myself reading at the end of sermon after sermon after sermon, a similar kind of ending, where folks at the end of sermons kind of invoke a coming time of blessed transformation. And I think historians may have a tendency to, when they get to that language, kind of their eyes glaze over. It seems like it's kind of abstract language, but I think that, that archival material where folks are talking explicitly about what they think the future is going to be like is really kind of influential. So I think that one of the ways that this work changed the work that I do as a historian is I pay much more attention now when people talk about what they think will happen next. I think that that's a really important category of historical analysis.
Okay, follow-up question here from Eric Fackler. Um, did you ever find out if Reverend Marsden actually went south and saw the effects of slavery himself in person?
Yeah. Eric, he wrote that passage while he was sitting on the beach in Bermuda, watching enslaved laborers bent over raking salt on the beach. So yeah, he did. And in fact, it was that experience of seeing that brutality that partially motivated that entry. However, he actually, I think that even more so than seeing the oppression, he was really angry at the way in which he saw slavery in Bermuda as distracting white potential Christians from listening to his sermons. He believed that slavery was creating a kind of a greed that was blocking the gospel. So even more than Marsden's compassion for the enslaved laborers, which he had some, was his kind of deep fear that he would fail as a missionary because of the institution of slavery.
Interesting. Related question here from Melinda Kalinzis. Again, thank you for asking us this. What was the most interesting, strangest, most niche primary source you used in your research?
Well, actually, okay, so I was in the papers of Edward Dromgoole, who was a Methodist minister. This was at the University of North Carolina. And in the middle of his sermon notes, he had the cure for cancer. So that was kind of exciting. I still have that if anybody needs it. It involves a lot of boiling of roots. I'm not quite so sure it will work. So that's a kind of fun thing. Yeah, I guess for me, the archival work that I did, was rarely kind of strange or fun. I mean, I read so many sermons. I read so many kind of diaries. I guess if you want something else kind of fun, reading Angelina Grimke's love letters are pretty wild. Her kind of desire to have celestial union without the bonds of physical connection. I don't quite know how that works, but it was thought-provoking to say the least, I'll say. I should probably stop before I give myself.
Someone needs to get you a drinking soon. Let me ask another question here that is not really rapid fire, but I think it is something that you need to discuss, especially for a wider audience. Are you going to give this book to your parents? And what do you think they will say? And you might want to explain to people why that's important.
Yeah. So, okay. All right. I'll try to address this as frankly as I can. I grew up in a religious community that continues to inform the way that I think about the world. And in many ways, the writing of this book is a wrestling with the faith that I grew up with and the faith that evolved through the study of the past. So I do think that this book, for those that have ears to hear, if you will, can highlight the reality that, I think Frederick Douglass said it best. His quote, "Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive one as good, pure, and holy is a necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked." And so I do think that this is a story about really the limitations of American Christianity, past and present. And if you read it, I think it also offers windows towards a Christianity that is the Christianity of Christ.
That's fascinating, and it leads to this follow-up question about what you hope the big impact of this book is beyond the academy. We all write books for various reasons, and one of the conversation starters we discussed was for non-historians, for people who are not playing inside baseball and know the historiography. What is it that you want them to take away from this book? So if I ask you, you get to speak to a group of people who are well-meaning, want to learn more about 19th century Christianity. You might even be a faith community, but they're not in any way scholars, and they just really want to learn. What do you think is the biggest takeaway from this book?
Well, I'll start by saying that the thought that anybody reads this book is really humbling. The thought that somebody would read it and it's not their job to read it is maybe even overwhelming. But I did try to tell a broad and accessible story. You're going to get 80 years of American history in only 210 pages. I tried to write in a way that was kind of accessible. And I think, a few themes are going to come through. One, the way in which religion wove white supremacy into the very fabric of the nation. That's an unavoidable reality. Also, the way that religion was used to try to attempt to unwind that weaving of white supremacy in the nation. You're going to get both the inspiring and the limiting story here of American abolitionism. And I think that, it's undeniable that this has contemporary resonances in our current world. I will, those of you that know me, I have a tendency to sermonize, and I will only resist it partially. I'll say that there are maybe two things that studying this book has changed the way I think about our contemporary world. One, calls for unity and kind of emphasis on coming together. That language was used aggressively and coercively against abolitionism. So quite frankly, when I see folks make calls for unity, I'm wondering whose voices are they trying to silence by emphasizing unity? In what ways are calls for coming together really just calls of limiting movements for justice? Second, I do think that, the story of American abolitionism is mostly a story of struggle and failure. The vision of abolitionists, struggled to come true. Their tactics were largely stymied. But despite that, breakthroughs occurred, often in kind of unexpected ways. So I think one of the lessons here for our contemporary world is that if you are part of a struggle for justice, don't expect quick and easy successes. Don't expect your plans to lead to fruition in the way that you expect. But just because it's seeming like your experience is a line of failure doesn't mean that a breakthrough is in fact not in the offing as a result of your labor.
Ben, that's a really wonderful set of answers. And I will say that as I've watched you revise this book project over the last couple of years, I became one with your argument. And so I very often know what you're going to say because we've went back and forth so many times, but I've never heard you say that. I've never heard you say those things. And I think that's really powerful and important to remember, especially when you're talking to people who are non-specialists. They're not in historiography courses. They want to know why history matters. And you offered a very challenging answer. You didn't offer a nice little pat, smiley face answer. That's a really challenging answer, but it still gives us ways to think about expanding the structure of possibilities in our own time, to get back to your earliest formulations about this project. So I really want to thank you for that. I think that was really heartfelt and well said. Just a few shout outs here. So Gil Wright wants to say, hey, is this an associate of yours? Is that part of the Wright family?
Hi, Dad.
Hello, Mr. Wright. And on behalf of all of us, thank you for raising such a wonderful, wonderful young scholar. We're going to say hi to Whitney Stewart, a great scholar in her own right. Ben, you know what I'm talking about. And we want to thank everyone for tuning in to this remote author series. Ben, you're going to offer some thank yous in just a minute as we wrap up. I want to also thank some folks at the LSU Press, including LB Kovac, who's done just wonderful work over the last day and a half setting this up and making sure that even though I teach at a technological university, I don't have to touch the tech here. So thank you. Thank you to all of you for these great questions. And I'll remind everyone that you can purchase Ben Wright's Bonds of Salvation at any number of places, including Amazon, at the LSU Press website, at your favorite independent bookstore. Remember, books change lives, and this is another book that will change lives. So make sure you support any and all publishers, university presses, independent bookstores, because we want to make sure they're here for the long haul. Ben, you should be congratulated on producing a wonderful, impactful, and powerful book. This has been a great session. I've learned more. You should be very happy, pleased, and honored with what you've done. Thank you for inviting me in.
Well, thank you, Rich. I have to start by thanking Rich for doing this and for, years and years of mentorship, friendship, and an example of what excellent scholarship looks like. I want to echo the thanks to LSU Press. I have a long set of acknowledgments because there's so many people that I owe thanks to, and I'm not going to repeat all of them here. But I'll end by maybe saying that, I saw several of my students ask questions in the chat, and that's really kind of touching. And really anybody that takes the time to seriously engage with this history, you have my thanks. And please don't be shy in reaching out. I'd be happy to talk more about this work or these issues with anybody. Thanks for caring.